All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to the real-world AJAX with ASP.NET talk. Realize it's early in the morning, sort of, 8:30, after the party especially. Hopefully everyone had a good first day at MIX. My name is Nikhil Kothari. I'm a software architect at Microsoft working in developer division. I work on various parts of the web platform, specifically ASP.NET, our AJAX framework, and Silverlight. And what I'm going to be talking here is a sort of a deeper look at AJAX, looking at features beyond what we ship out of the box, as you might use our offering to build real-world apps. Kind of look at some of the problems you might face while building these AJAX apps and what you might do about them and how our framework helps you in that direction. I'll also share some early sort of prototype or early thinking that we're actually thinking about, sort of things to add into the framework going forward in the future. I was actually debating whether I'd do that, but I thought it would be fun. I actually coded up something this morning. We'll see how that goes. Just kind of show it to you. So a quick overview. I'm actually going to touch briefly on kind of just showing you an overview of ASP.NET AJAX, what you get. How many people have used ASP.NET AJAX? Most of you. So I can probably skim through that first overview really quick for just those of you who haven't seen it yet. And then the rest of the talk is going to be sort of concept demo, looking at AJAX in a deeper way. And along the way, I'll kind of show you ASP.NET AJAX, obviously. So in terms of the overview, ASP.NET AJAX supports a wide variety of programming styles for writing AJAX applications. The first and foremost, the most popular feature is something we call partial rendering. It's basically allows you to say, write an ASP.NET page, a regular sort of postback style page, mark it up so that you can say, I want to update this part of the page without a full postback, and ASP.NET just does everything for you. You don't have to write any script, don't have to really learn a whole lot of AJAX. The AJAX control toolkit kind of takes that to the next step. It's an open source project on Codeplex. It has a huge community behind it, and it offers several controls, I think upwards of 30 plus controls. And these are server controls. You just drop them on your page again, and they kind of give you some key interesting scenarios without any JavaScript programming. So that's kind of the server-centric model of programming, where most of your code is actually living on the server. The flip side is one where you're actually writing some JavaScript code, you're bringing down some logic to the client, and ASP.NET AJAX helps you there as well. The first thing that we do is actually provide a bridge that allows you to call into web services, whether it's ASMX services or WCF SVC services. We make it very simple for you to call them without thinking about XML HTTP, without thinking about serialization, those types of things. And last but not least, we have the script framework itself, Microsoft AJAX.js. It's a script file. It can be used even outside ASP.NET if you're using some other server technology. It basically gives you a type system and a general sort of model for writing client-side code. So let me show you this demo, but we'll breeze through it since most of you here have actually played with it. So I have my initial page here. This doesn't have any AJAX. It's basically very familiar server controls. If you use ASP.NET, a repeater control that's going to show a list of search results, an object data source that's going to actually do the query and bring it into the page for displaying and data binding. And I'll run this. Oops, let's close this. And I can type in, let's say, Vegas and search for something, and it goes off. I have a little snapshot of the Encarta database, and it pulls up some articles over here. So nothing fancy here, other than the fact that when I clicked it, it actually did a full postback and refreshed the page. Obviously, I want to get rid of that with my AJAX app. So the next thing I'm going to go ahead and do is take the same page. As I said, you get a page working in the regular postback mode, and then you mark it up to indicate what needs to update and when. Specifically, in this page, I want the search results to update without a full postback, and so I've wrapped it in an update panel control. This is the control that says, here's the part the contents of this control update without a full postback. And I also have a triggers collection on that update panel that says when the search button is clicked, which is up here, go ahead and update this update panel. The rest of the page is exactly the same. In fact, one of the key things that you want to keep in mind when you're using the update panel and something doesn't work is check if your page works in the regular postback mode. Turn off partial rendering, see if it works. That usually uncovers a lot of the problems that you might be seeing. So when I run this particular page and search for the same thing, you'll see it updated the page, didn't navigate. You can see the back button wasn't actually enabled, so it didn't navigate. And then I can search for more stuff, and it'll continue doing the same, updating the contents of that update panel without a full postback. So this is sort of the server-centric model. I'll show you now a page that does functionally the same thing, but written using sort of what we call the client-centric model, where you're writing code on the client to call into a web service and then update the UI on the client using JavaScript. So specifically what I have is a web service. Let me open that up. I have something called an article service. It's a regular web service, so it's marked as a web service, and it's got web methods. In order to expose it to script, what we want to do is use JSON formatting on the wire, which is much more performant for script scenarios as opposed to full SOAP services. And so I marked it as a script service, and I've marked some methods as script methods as well. And basically what I want to do is call these methods from the client. So to do that, the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do in my script manager control, which is on every ASP.NET AJAX page, is drop in a service reference. I'm giving it the path to the ASMX. And what this will do is actually generate a script proxy on the fly, which allows me to call methods that in turn do all the underlying sort of request plumbing and call the method on the server. So when I do this, I actually get a script proxy, and I've extracted it just to kind of give you a sense of what it looks like. It's regular JavaScript code. It creates a class called article service, and it has a few methods. For example, it has a method called get articles that matches what I had on the server. So now that I have this service reference in my page, I can go ahead and use it. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do in my button click handler is call that service, samples.articleservice.getArticleHeaders, and I'm passing in the text box value and a callback to call when the results are available on the client asynchronously. In that callback, I'm essentially looping through the results, which is a set of articles, building up some HTML. I'm using a string builder object to concatenate all of the strings, and then finally take the string, the final built-up string, and shove it as inner HTML of my panel that I have here. And so this does exactly the same thing. Let's try this again. So same thing here. Now let me show you. There's a tool. It's similar to actually the web development, the IE development toolbar that you actually saw yesterday. It actually enables you to do HTTP logging as well. So I'll go ahead and turn on logging and try again. And you can see there was a request that went out. And you probably won't be able to see all the way this font's smaller, but you can try this tool out by downloading it. I'll have the URL later. You can see the request body was just the keyword, and the response was basically a JSON object graph, which was an array of articles which have title, preview, content, URL, and so on. And this kind of shows you what's going on the wire. And one thing that you might be interested in doing when you download this tool is look at the traffic pattern between the kinds of for the kinds of applications you're writing, where you might be able to optimize something. One thing you'll notice is that in the partial rendering scenario, where you're dropped an update panel, the request responses are usually a lot larger than they are with a web service call. And so there's a little trade-off. Both of them are valid for the right kinds of scenarios. But this tool will let you understand what's happening. So let's keep moving. That's sort of the quick overview. Actually, I can show you one other thing, the control toolkit. So here's the control toolkit. Again, I have the URL at the end of the deck. And it has an online demo of all the controls. And here's, for example, a control called an accordion. And you just drop the server control. Here's the sort of markup. Has the markup somewhere. It's basically an accordion run equal server, and it kind of gives you this behavior. And you can kind of play with these controls and see if something matches what your application needs, and download this code and use it. All right, so let's switch back to slides. So when I got this talk, the title, and I was thinking, what am I actually going to talk about when I say AJAX in the real world? And I was thinking, why don't I go ahead and find some canonical sites that truly exemplify AJAX and kind of talk to them a little bit. And 2 years ago, this would have been actually fairly easy. I could have probably handpicked those 5 sites that really kind of scream AJAX. And Outlook Web Access, the mapping applications, all those are what you'd 2 years ago were kind of the showcase applications. And now I kind of look at it, and it actually became fairly hard because every site has something going on that's probably an AJAX-like behavior. And in fact, in the years since it was sort of first became popular, AJAX has become mainstream. And not only are a lot of site developers actually implementing it, but a lot of users are actually expecting it. They're not so much expecting AJAX as in a technical term, but if you come across a site that doesn't kind of use AJAX correctly, you actually notice it. So in that sense, it's become mainstream. However, at the same time, you want to keep in mind that you don't really need to go overboard by adding lots of script. You kind of want the right level of use, and usually a subtle amount of AJAX goes a long way. Because it's fundamentally not about throwing in script, it's fundamentally about creating a better user experience. Whether it's about richer data entry, like whether it's like an autocomplete thing, or whether it's understanding what the user's always been entering into that text box, those types of things. Or it's a fluid user interface, for example, prefetching data because the user is going to go to page 2. Those types of things go a long way, as well as rich data visualization, showing different views of the same data, for example, and not just like a grid, not just a list, that kind of thing. So, and certainly AJAX is not just about making XML requests and updating the UI. It's a lot more than that. So because it's a lot more than that, and as you start using it, you actually do run into a few challenges. The first and foremost one is sort of a broad sort of categorization, script complexity. It just stands for the more script you throw at the browser, the more complex your application becomes, the harder it becomes to maintain, the harder it becomes to have a better designer-developer workflow. So that's just kind of, I've kind of lumped it into this thing called script complexity. The next two are interesting in that AJAX is sort of infamous for the lack of indexability and the lack of bookmarkability or the right back button behavior. You can go search for it, and if you put these two terms together, you'll see a lot of articles or pages on the web that say, hey, AJAX is broken for this. And I'll show you how you can mitigate some of that in the demos. As I said, users have come to expect AJAX, and their expectations are sort of on the rise as it becomes sort of more and more commonplace. The other one is putting out a lot of script. You want to think about how you're tracing what's happening on the client, how you're logging, how you have the right diagnostics in your script. And so the list goes on. There's performance, there's security, there's browser compatibility. It just goes on. And so we're going to pick a few and speak to those a little bit. So the first one I wanted to kind of touch on is this thing I call script complexity. And as I said, it's basically the more script you throw at the browser, you kind of want to look back and think about how you're organizing your script, how you're setting up your code base so that it's actually maintainable. And one of the things that ASP.NET AJAX definitely brings to the table is this idea of writing components and encapsulating your logic using a sort of OOP pattern just to organize your functionality and data. And it provides a nice way to separate content and the presentation parts of your page from the logic parts of your page. I'll again touch on this partial rendering feature. Obviously, that's a great way to reduce complexity if it works. And by all means, if it works, do use it. So for the demos, I'm going to show you this concept called behaviors, which are this encapsulation mechanism that lets you organize your code a lot better and be a little bit more disciplined about it. It's really just a pattern. So let's kind of go and see what behaviors are all about. You can close all of these. So what I'm going to go ahead and do, the first demo I'm going to do is a very simple demo. It's actually one of the controls in the toolkit. It's a little watermark control. I want to have a text box, and I want to display a prompt in it when the user focuses into the text box, the prompt disappears, lets the user type in. So that's a pretty simple thing. I have my text box ready to go. Let me go ahead and create a script file. So I'll choose this template called the AJAX client behavior, and I'll call this watermark behavior. And it starts me off with a little template for a sort of a baseline behavior. And let me actually run that, or show you how I use that. So what I'm going ahead and doing is creating an instance of this behavior, setting up a couple properties, and associating it with the keywords text box. Obviously, I've not implemented the properties, and you'll see I'll get a script error saying, hey, watermark text is not a property of this behavior. There you go. So this is the AJAX library kind of being more informative about errors. So let's actually go ahead and implement those. And I'll implement this particular behavior just to kind of give you a flavor of writing some script here. I'll go ahead and add a couple properties, watermark text and watermark class. And go ahead and implement a couple of properties. And actually, I'm going to copy some code just so that you don't have to see me, sit and type a bunch of script. So basically, what I just did was added a getter and a setter for the watermark text property, and then did the same thing for a watermark class. Okay, simple enough. Now I actually want to go ahead and use this. So let me write a couple of event handlers. I want to track focus and blur events on the text box to track the user sort of tabbing into the text box and tabbing away. So go ahead and write 2 event handlers on focus and on blur. And what I want to do is, again, I'll resort to some code here because I realize I'm probably going to make some typos, and then we're going to have a fun time debugging them. So what I'm going in and doing in those methods is when the blur event happens, when the focus is lost, I want to go ahead and show the watermark. And conversely, when I get a focus, I want to hide the watermark. And basically, I'm showing the watermark and if there's no text in the text box. And the last thing I want to do now that I have these methods is actually subscribe to the right events so that my onFocus and onBlur methods are actually called. So to do that, I'm going to implement my initialize method. And so what I have here is I'm calling the base class's initialize method, and then after that I can add my own logic here. And what I'm doing is attaching to the focus event, I'm creating a delegate to the onFocus, and conversely I'm also attaching to the blur event on the same text box and attaching the onBlur. Now one thing I want to do is, because I'm attaching events, I also want to detach or unsubscribe when the page unloads. So I'm going to implement the dispose logic, and that's pretty simple. I just want to clear all the handlers that I attach to this particular element, right? And at this point, I should be able to run. Oops. So what I have, again, to remind is basically I'm creating an instance of that behavior that I just wrote, setting up the couple of properties that I added to that behavior, and attaching it to this keywords text box, which is up here. And over here, I have my watermark CSS class that's applied whenever the watermark is shown, and it basically makes the text look gray. So let's run this. And so you can see I've got my watermark. It shows the prompt here. And when I tab into it, the prompt disappears. When I tab out of it, the prompt reappears. And so the rest of the functionality is the same. Now that I've typed in some text and I tab out, it retains that, doesn't show the prompt again. So it's a very simple watermark behavior. So the function of the behavior is probably not a whole lot interesting, but the key point is what it lets me do is keeps my UI, which is this text box, completely separate from my behavior. So I can go write this behavior separately, and then I can go attach it to this text box. And I can use this pattern of attaching for all sorts of interesting things. I can reuse this multiple times. I can create, for example, multiple instances of a watermark behavior and apply it to different text boxes on the same page. So it's a nice sort of encapsulation mechanism. So let's keep, as I said, behaviors are a fairly powerful concept. They apply broadly. So let's kind of look at another sample. And what I have here is a page. Let's actually run this to kind of show what it does. And it's similar looking. Basically, let me again type in and search. And you'll see it shows the titles, and I can click this button, and it shows the details. It toggles between titles and details. So this is, again, fairly straightforward. But you might imagine to implement this, I'm probably listening to the click event on this button. I'm listening to the click event on that button. And I'm going and looping through the elements and toggling their visibility. That's something you can certainly do. But one key thing to think about while tackling sort of script complexity is let the browser do what it does best and leverage what the browser does. Specifically, the browser has a CSS engine inside it. And so if I can simply toggle one little property, one little CSS class somewhere, and have the browser find all the elements that match it and hide them and show them, that's goodness. I don't need to go and write a bunch of script to find those elements myself. So let's kind of see that in action. So what I have here is my repeater that displays the list of search results. It has a couple of buttons which allow me to toggle between titles only and titles and preview mode. And then I have basically each search result is a hyperlink followed by a paragraph that contains the preview text. And that's identified by a class called preview. What I'm doing is attaching a behavior, the detail level behavior, to this article panel, which contains all of the search results. So I'm only creating a single behavior and attaching it to some top-level element that's going to affect everything within that element. What I also now have, let's see what else I have in this page. These buttons are a little special. They have a class called detail level. Okay, both of these buttons have a class called detail level, and you'll see how that behavior actually uses that in a moment. And then they have an expando called detail level, which says which mode to actually toggle the page into, titles and preview. So now that I've got my UI, now I want to look at my CSS. So up at the top of my page, I have the CSS that says, for all preview paragraphs inside the article panel, when the article panel has a title class, go ahead and hide all the preview paragraphs. That's display none. However, when the same panel and the same paragraph, when that panel is in details, has a CSS class set to details, go ahead and show those paragraphs. So what I'm telling the browser is I'm setting up a couple of rules, and now all I need to do is figure out how to toggle the CSS class of this panel, and I'm all set. I don't need to do any more work. The browser is going to process these rules as I change the CSS class. So let's look, with that information, let's actually look at the implementation of this thing. It's actually very, very small. It's a few lines of code. In my initialize method, I am going ahead and attaching a click event handler to that top level panel, to that article panel. And events in the DOM bubble up. So when I click on a button, they bubble up, and I can handle the event at a top level. So I don't, again, have to attach an event handler to all elements in my UI if I can find a common route where I can handle them. So specifically, I'm handling those events at the article panel level, and I'm checking if the target of the event, specifically what was clicked, has a detail level. If it has a detail level, I'm changing the class name, which is the CSS class, of that panel to the detail level property on that particular button. And that's it. That's all I have to do, pretty much, right? The rest of the code is basically, the dispose logic where I remove the handler that I just attached. So to recap, what I'm doing is, in my behavior, I'm attaching the behavior to this div, which will contain the buttons as well as the search result. The buttons have a class detail level, and they also have a detail level attribute, expando. And I'm using the value of this expando and setting that as the class of this article panel dynamically. And then the preview paragraphs are right here. They have a class preview, and they match these two rules depending on what the value of the article panel's CSS class is. So this is nice. I don't have to do a whole lot of work I can just use the browser's CSS engine. Here's another thing it helps, actually. When I'm inserting content dynamically, I don't have to keep subscribing to more and more event handlers. So let's kind of look at this working. So I've attached my behavior to this article panel, and it's showing, let's say I toggle it into this preview mode as well. Now I go ahead and do another query to bring in related articles for that keyword. If I were subscribing to each and every if I were manipulating the visibility of each paragraph individually, I'd have to go and run some code after these second set of results come in. But because I'm using the CSS, everything just works because the browser applies those CSS rules to the new content as well. So I just insert some new content into this panel when I click this button, and all the CSS rules just kicked in. So does that make sense? Yeah, basically, the idea is use the CSS engine whenever you can, as opposed to rolling your own logic. All right, so let's keep going. So far, what we've seen is a couple of behaviors that handle events and do some stuff for the DOM, but that's not all a behavior can do. A behavior can pretty much do whatever it wants. And so what I'm going to show you next is a little mashup scenario that I implemented as a behavior. So my search results are pretty bland. They're just like a little title and a little line of text. I want to spice it up a little bit. And specifically what I want to do is look at the title, do a Flickr query for the most relevant photo, and show a thumbnail of that photo in my UI. So what I've done is updated the template of each search result to include a hyperlink of class CSS class set to photo, and the title is on the anchor as its tooltip. And then what I will go ahead and do is attach this Flickr mashup behavior to the article panel. And what this behavior will do is go look for all anchors that have this class photo, find the title, go off and make a web request to Flickr, get the results, and show a photo within that. So let's see this running. Let me type the same thing again here. And you'll see this goes off asynchronously and fetches some content. Come on. There you go. One of them came through. The network's maybe a little flaky, but basically you can see asynchronously this thing kicked off and brought some content, specifically a photo in this particular case. So let me just show you that really quick. Again, it's the same sort of thing going on. It's a behavior. It overrides the initialize method. And you can kind of look at the specifics of this code when you have the samples available. But effectively what it's doing is looping through all of the elements that are anchors and seeing if they're of class photo. If they are, it's going ahead and creating a web request to Flickr. And when the response comes back asynchronously, it goes ahead and creates an image and puts that as the content of the anchor. And so now you've got this image, and you can click on it to actually go to see the larger version of the image. So simple enough behavior, kind of just shows you a very simple mashup kind of scenario. So last thing I want to show you is one of the things that we're thinking of in terms of what we'll do in the future. And this is kind of gaining some interesting buzz in the sort of community around AJAX, where the notion of templating on the client. So if you're using ASP.NET on the server, you're very familiar with the concept of templates. Repeater controls have templates. They define the structure of each item. And they're nice because it lets the designer could go develop a template and have the developer kind of go implement the data binding logic. Not sure what happened there. So the idea is to bring the concept of templates down to the client. So let me refresh what I just did in the quick overview demo. I had this search results where I was making this web request call, and then I was going ahead and building up my UI in code here. So this is basically UI, some HTML fragment that's interspersed deep in my code. And it would be nice to be able to take that out of my code and let the designer kind of work on that part and not have it be hard-coded in here. So let's kind of show that. And so what I have here now is basically a div marked as a template area of my page, which you can then hide using a CSS rule. And within that div, I have a template, which is another div. And this is the structure of my template. It's a header with a paragraph with a span and a hyperlink. Now what I can go ahead and do is I've included my script file, this template engine.js, which is something I alluded to earlier that I wrote up this morning. And it's a very small template engine. The code's not complex at all. It's about like 100 lines of code. But it's effectively what it does is it says, well, if you give me this content, I'll go ahead and parse it and compile it into a function like you would have written over here. So it effectively creates this kind of function. It creates it parses out tokens. So here are the tokens, like here's where the title goes, here's where the preview goes, and so on and so forth. It parses that out and builds up a function on the fly for you to go call. So what I'm doing here is creating a template. This call here is what does all that parsing and compilation. And then I'm going to go ahead and loop through my articles that come back from my web service call instantiate on the template, passing in the data, the article. And so this template engine then goes out and pulls out, article.title, puts that over here, article.preview, puts that over here, and gives me an instantiated element that I can then go and put into my DOM. So with this thing here, now I've got my UI completely separate from my code. And in fact, if you look in split view, and if I toggle the visibility back on, you can see I've got my template here, and I've got a preview. And obviously, it can be richer than this. But you can now have a designer kind of work on the HTML and just kind of put the right placeholders for here's where the data goes. And then the code can do the right thing at runtime. Thank you. All right, let's keep going and back to slides. So hopefully that kind of shows you, some small set of patterns that you can think about how to contain complexity, how to separate your content from your presentation. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive thing, but hopefully kind of gets you thinking along those lines and using behaviors where appropriate. So the first problem I mentioned that kind of AJAX has a bad rap for is navigation and bookmarkability. And it kind of manifests itself in two ways. I'm working with my application, and the user clicks back, and it goes all the way back. You saw a demo of that yesterday in the keynote, where IE8 is actually adding features to make it possible for AJAX, the developers, to kind of do this much more easily. So anyway, the general idea is AJAX is kind of broken from from the backbone perspective as well as bookmarkability. And I kind of actually take the opposite view, and I look at it as if it's an opportunity. Basically, the browser is not aware of your page updates it's doing. And so as far as it is concerned, there's no navigation happening. And so you now have a very clean slate to go put whatever you care about in the navigation history and nothing else. And I'll show you an example of this. I'll show you a regular postback page, an AJAX page, and then one with the history applied, and how the ability to go control history on your end gives you a much better end story. And ASP.NET AJAX provides this feature that makes it very simple to actually use history. It's basically two APIs: add history state, which allows you to update the state, and then you handle an event called a navigated event to know when that state has changed. And we do all the work underneath the covers to make it work across all of the browsers. And specifically in IE8, we'll leverage the new feature as well. So let's kind of look at this in action. So as I said, let me first show you the postback page, kind of what the behavior you get when you're updating the page every time around. So I have a simple, the same kind of thing here where I have the search results thing as well as a little comment form. And what I can do, let's say I search for Seattle, and that brings up some results. It did a full postback, and so the back button got enabled. But let me go ahead and let's say I add a comment, hello, and submit that. And as far as the browser goes, that's a new page, and so that's a new history point, right? So when I go back, you'll see it went back, and those entries are there in the text box. But that's probably not what your application wants. That comment's been submitted. There's no reason to kind of go back and show it again. And then I can click back again, and it goes back to the initial state. And so in a regular postback page, every submit is a navigation step, which may or may not be what you want, and oftentimes isn't. So let's kind of show, let me show the AJAX version of this page. And it's basically, again, the same thing. I've put my UI inside. Actually, for this particular page, all I'm doing is making web service calls. I'm getting the articles using a web service, and I'm submitting the comments using a web service, and updating the page using the results that come back from the web service. So again, obviously no postback. And so I'll do the same thing again, search for Seattle. You can see the back button wasn't enabled, so I can't navigate away. However, if I had come to this particular page from some other application, or let's say from some search results on a search engine, if I click back now, I would actually go all the way back, which is probably not the right thing. And I can type in the same thing, hello again, and post a comment, and that comment gets submitted, and it shows up down there at the bottom of the page. Still no navigation history, right? So when you apply AJAX in sort of the most straightforward way, you basically lose all navigation history, which is why AJAX has sort of this sort of bad rap associated with it. So let's go and fix this. And so I have this third version of this page that now enables the history feature in ASP.NET. And that's a simple little property here. On my script manager control, I have enable history set to true, and that turns on our history framework. And then what I'm going to go ahead and do is at the bottom of my script here, I'm handling that event I mentioned, the navigate event, which is off of the application class. And I'm setting the on-page navigate method as the event handler. And basically, this function will be called every time the state changes on the URL. And I can go ahead and use that state change to go off and restore the right state of my page, as you'll see in a minute. And then the last thing I'm going to go ahead and do is obviously call add history state. And specifically what I'm doing here is when the search results come back after I make a web service call, I'm going to go ahead and call add history point. And I'm going to pass in the state that I'm going to update is the query field. And it's going to be the context, which is the keyword that I use to actually make the query. And this will be apparent as soon as I run this. Let's actually see that. So let's kind of search for the same thing. Seattle, search. And now you can see the URL there updated. There's a little hash mark followed by query equals Seattle. And basically the hash mark, everything after the hash mark is the only way to update the URL without actually navigating to a different page. And so this is the standard sort of trick that we use to simulate history. So the back button's enabled here, right? And I can go back. And let me actually show you. Let me actually put some other history state here first. Let's say I put in Belgium. So now it's query equals Belgium up at the top. When I go back, it's query equals Seattle. And the page can handle that event and update the UI of the page to match the URL. What I can also do is copy this URL, and let's say go open Firefox, or bookmark it, open it later in a different browser or in the same browser, and type in that URL there. And you can see that the page actually picks up the initial value as well. So basically, this gets you not only the back button behavior, but also bookmarkability. And to complete the point here, let's say I add in another comment here, and I post. That didn't quite work. It's probably it's a bug in my page. I didn't probably put the right attribute here. Let me actually open a new browser window just to show this. And so this thing, the comment form itself doesn't update the history. So now you don't have this sort of odd state in your application where I can hit back and go into a pre-filled form that doesn't make sense to kind of submit again. So does that make sense? Basically what we have is this feature that will let you call these APIs at the right points in time. Let me show that once again. So here's my search button click. It calls do search with a flag that says update history true. Do search calls the web service. It passes in the keyword that you use to search as the context if the update history flag is set to true. And finally, in the search complete, I go ahead and call add history point with that query containing the keyword that I searched for as my history state. Now, the reason why I'm doing this flag update history is because I don't want to update the history when I'm actually restoring history. Basically, you want to update the URL only when a user action caused the page to change, not when your code is listening to the navigated event and changing the view. Okay. And the last point I wanted to make here is I'm showing you these client-side APIs, add history point on the application class. We have the exact same API on the server. So if you're writing an update panel-based page, you can call the APIs on Script Manager to add history state and handle the navigated event. So you have this function on both sides of your application. Okay, so the next interesting one is indexability. And for most sites, almost like 99+% sites probably that are on the web, you need to be indexable so that you can actually be searched and you can actually show up in search results. That's how a lot of traffic comes into most sites, sometimes over 60% of your traffic. Now, the search engine, or any crawler for that matter, relies on the presence of static data within the page to actually index. And meaningful data, not the structure of your application, not the logic of your application, but actual data that you're going to show in your application. And the reason why AJAX apps fare poorly is because a lot of them actually make web service calls to go get some data and show that in the page. And the page is relatively empty, and so there's nothing to index. So an alternate way to kind of think about AJAX is, why don't I go back to putting the data statically in the page, as regular HTML content that the search engine can see, and then I'll write some AJAX code on my page that extracts the data from that content and present a better view on top of that data. And then what the AJAX script can also then do is obviously go from one page to another page without refreshing. And if you do have this kind of paging-like scenario, then you want to make sure you also have a sitemap for your site that tells the search engine where to go look. So the static content on the page tells the search engine crawler, what content to index, and the sitemap tells the crawler where to go look to index. Okay, so let me show this in action. So let me run my AJAX version of my app first, and you'll see it's basically a scenario. It's basically a scenario where I'm placing photos on a map, geocoded photos. It's probably trying to hit some server to get the map control. Let's try this again. I know I've been having issues with my connection here. Nope, everything looks fine there. Well, let's kind of look at the code in the meantime. Basically, what I have here is my script manager. It has a service reference to the virtual earth map control. It has a service reference to my photo service, which returns a list of photos. And then the content within the page is pretty much this div that will contain the map control here. It doesn't have the photos itself. And then I have some script here that runs on load, goes off and loads the photos. And in the completed event handler, I'll go ahead and plot those photos on the map. Let's see if that showed up. Oh, there you go. So basically, I have this, a couple photos here that are on sort of like on the, taken recently off the strip here. And so, however, what you can see if I run this page in Mozilla. Hopefully it'll be quicker this time. Actually, let me go ahead and disable JavaScript, and then reload the page. And what you see is this empty page. It doesn't actually have any data in it. And so this is kind of what the search engine sees when it doesn't run any script. So that obviously isn't very helpful to the search engine. Let's kind of look at a different version of this page where now I've actually put these images right in my content here as static markup, right? And then my page load event handler will actually go ahead and implement the map functionality on top of that static data. So let's kind of go look at that. Again, I've got my script disabled. And you'll see both photos show up there with a little title that should help the search engine a little bit, right? And now if I re-enable my script, and hopefully it'll work. Maybe. Okay. You'll have to trust me that it will do the map thing like it did in IE a moment before. That it does, essentially, it shows you this. And it doesn't show you the static content because the static content is hidden in the script. So the script essentially says, go ahead and hide all of the static content. Now, one thing that happens is that the static content is being hidden dynamically. So it's actually going to show up on the page and then flash away for a little instant there, which is not particularly nice. The other thing that this page shows is obviously this is static data, and that's probably not what you're going to have in your application. This is probably going to be bound to a query of some sort. So let's kind of see that. And to facilitate both of those things, to hide the flash as well as to data bind this list of photos, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I have a sample control that I've written called the JSON data control. And this is very much like a repeater control. It renders out its item template for however many photos there are. That's the static content. It also captures the data, specifically the fields I want for my client-side logic. So I want the URL, I want the title, and the lat long to be able to show it on the map. And the third thing it does is it actually uses a little bit of script in a clever way to actually hide the content if script is enabled. So you never see the flash. And let's see how successful I am here. Again. Okay. So you didn't see the flash. And if I go look at the source now, you'll see that I have my photos right in here. And these were outputted using the item template of that JSON data control. And now this little script hack that I was talking to you about was, here's the script tag. And it writes out document.write display a div display none. So what this says is if script is enabled, go ahead and write that div tag out. And that's going to hide all the static content as the browser parses this page. And there's correspondingly a closed div in a document.write here. However, if script is disabled, like it was in Mozilla when I turned on that feature, or if this is being viewed by a search engine crawler, this script is not going to execute. And so this content is all very much visible to that, right? And so now what you've got is sort of two views of your data, and one of your views, the static view, only shows up for the places where AJAX is where you can't run your AJAX logic. So with this kind of pattern, you can now start putting out your data as semantic markup. So what do I mean by semantic markup? An image is an image. A paragraph or some text is actually a span. And if you have headers, then you'd use the right heading level, H1 through H6. Anchors are anchors. So use the right sort of HTML constructs that search engines know about and use that as a way to send your data to the client. So let me kind of show that because this demo didn't quite work all that well. I have a slide here. So here's what I wrote in my page, or I had some server-side logic to kind of output that. However, I'm actually outputting, that's what I'm sending out of the server. A script tag with document.write in here, my actual static data, the meaningful stuff that I want the search engine to see, and then the corresponding close div tag in a script tag. And then I have this div, like the map frame, where my AJAX view is kind of actually going to go at runtime. And then finally, I have some script to actually go ahead and create the map using the data in the page. So when a browser kind of views this page and script is actually enabled, this is what the browser sees. It processes the script instructions as it parses the page. So it sees div style display none, all the static data, close div. So the browser is just not going to render that at all. And then I have my map frame and my script to actually render the map. And so you don't get that little instant flash where the content shows up as static content and then disappears. However, if I actually have this page being crawled by a search engine, then it doesn't process the script. It just ignores it, throws it away. And so what I have is the static content within that div and my empty map frame. But the key thing is this static content is all here in my page, all for indexing. And so this helps make sure the right words are there for someone when someone goes and searches for those words. Actually, your page is in one of the search results. Does that make sense? Last thing I want to show is going beyond AJAX. So a lot of what you're going to hear, obviously, at this conference is about Silverlight, and you might be developing AJAX apps, and you also are seeing users want more functionality than what is possible in today's browsers. And so while browsers are improving in terms of the capabilities, things like HTML5, you want to have some of those capabilities today. And especially sort of implement sort of a light-up model where if the browser has something like Silverlight, you want to go ahead and use its capabilities. What are some of the types of things you can do with these islands of Silverlight, where your Silverlight content is not the entire view, but it's probably like a rectangle within your application, or maybe even invisible. First and foremost, Silverlight brings the CLR. So you can obviously write managed code, even do things like background processing in background threads. You have access to local storage and files. You also can obviously use vector graphics and media. So let's kind of look at a simple demo of this. And Stefan, actually tomorrow at 10 o'clock, is going to actually dive deep into this topic. I'm going to kind of give you a cursory look at it. So let's close all of this. So what I have here is a little file called file.io.zap. And zap is basically a Silverlight application package. And Silverlight allows me to implement managed code that exposes APIs that can be scripted against. So as a quick example, here's my code for my Silverlight application. It doesn't have any UI. There's no XAML. It's basically like a file.io API, right? And in the constructor, what I'm going ahead and doing is registering a scriptable object called IO API, and it's basically a file.io object. And file.io is down here. It's marked as scriptable, so this is what tells the Silverlight engine saying, hey, here's this object. You can go ahead and expose this to script on the page. And I've got some methods on it, like get value, set value, and read file, basically allowing me to save some state to the user's preferences, as well as to retrieve it using the get value, set value. You can see I'm using this class called application settings, which is in Silverlight. And in read file, I'm going ahead and using the open file dialog to actually open up prompt the user for a file, select the file, read it. and hand back the text of the file to script. And all these members are marked as scriptable just to indicate what is actually exposed to the script. So now back on my page, I've actually instantiated Silverlight directly just to kind of keep the demo simple. I have this object tag with a source parameter that says file.io.zap, right? And so that's my little Silverlight application that I'm using. And then I've got code here that says, where file API is the Silverlight object tag .content.io API. And IO API was the name I chose for my set of scripting APIs. And I can now go ahead and do things like get value, so I can get values that I've stored into the user's preferences, or as well as set value. And then finally, I can also do things like read file. So let me actually show this working. And this is actually from a previous run. Let's try that again. So you can see that now there's no content. I can type in something, hello. And let's say for some reason I close the browser without submitting, and I want to save the sort of the form in draft mode on the user's machine so that they don't lose what they entered. I'm going to close this browser, didn't actually submit, reopen. And what it's going to go ahead and do is load up my preferences, and it actually shows those two values are in my user state. I can also go ahead and, let's say I had this comment field, and for some reason I had my comment kind of drafted up in a local file. I can go ahead and click this button, launch the file open dialog box, and pull up some text file. Let's say I pull this up, and it just goes. The Silverlight code goes ahead and reads the file using the regular .NET file IO APIs and hands this text back to script. And so now script can go do whatever it wants with it. And so in this particular case, the script just put it into this form. So there you go. This basically shows you a very simple use of Silverlight within an AJAX application to incrementally kind of use more functionality. And what I can do actually, just to kind of finish the pattern off, is you can decide one of two different things. So you could say, if Silverlight's not installed, I could hide this button, for example, this copy from file button. And so it's a light up. So if the client has Silverlight, go ahead and show this button. Or alternatively, you can actually have integrate into your site UI saying this site is much richer if you have Silverlight enabled, and you can prompt the user to go ahead and download it to get a much better experience on your site. And while I showed some fairly sort of not so visually pleasing kind of APIs, just the file IO APIs, you can imagine using Silverlight for doing all sorts of things like media, vector graphics to kind of do things like charting, interactive charts as opposed to a static image. So the capabilities are kind of endless, and you don't need to stop doing what you're doing today to be able to use Silverlight. You can start combining those two in interesting ways. So with that, I think I'm done. I think I have 15 minutes for Q&A. Feel free to ask any question. I think there are mics here, and thanks everyone for attending. So there's two mics on both sides. Feel free to ask your questions or raise your hand and just shout it out. There you go.
Hi. What's a good way to do lazy loading on a page?
The question is, what's the way to do lazy loading, and specifically like lazy loading of what? Okay. So the general question is how to do lazy loading of anything really. And again, the answer sort of depends on what you're trying to lazily load. You might be trying to lazily load script tags. So you're bringing in functionality on demand. And so what you can do is actually create script tags on the fly using the DOM API and set them to the right URL and add them to the document. And that will actually fetch those scripts in a deferred manner. So you can get your rendering up, you can get your baseline functionality up and running, and then you can kind of download auxiliary kind of functionality on the fly. Other kinds of lazy loading scenarios are like data. So you might be saying, go get first page of data which is, let's say, 10 records. And then go ahead, as the user's kind of viewing those 10 records, go ahead and fetch the next 10 and the next 10 and the next 10. So you can kind of do pre-fetching, sort of using a background, basically a timer that every, let's say, 100 milliseconds or 200 milliseconds, depends on your app, goes off and fetches more data in a predictive fashion. Those are the two kind of primary things. You want to think about how you show progress, how you show that the fact that you're actually lazily loading potentially in your application, how you might be able to cancel that. Those are the interesting things. Does that help? Okay. Anyone else? Questions? There's a question there. So the question is, when you're developing a rich internet app, as opposed to a traditional web app, are you supposed to develop a single page application because these applications are much more stateful on the client? And the answer is, these applications are indeed much more stateful, so you want to think about the boundary between the pages and where it makes sense to preserve state to stay on the same page. However, it doesn't mean that your application should be a single page. Navigation is still very much a valid scenario because I might want multiple entry points into my application, potentially. And it might be that I'm, one section of my site, for example, let's say, the products catalog is one part of my website, and I'm updating the product without navigating from one page to another page. However, the account management thing, account management functionality might be on a totally separate page, right? Where you aren't carrying a whole lot of state other than the user identity across from one page to another page. So the basic statement is that you want to think about what the boundaries are, but there's no rule that says you should have a single page. When navigation is the right thing to go do, you should be using navigation. So the question is, what's the best way to maintain state across navigation? And gosh, there's like several different ways, right? You can do, if you're saving state on the server, you've got session, you've got your whole database for that matter. If you might be using cookies, you set a cookie on one page and you retrieve the cookie on the next page. That's another way where the data kind of flows from the client to the server and back. You might be using the query string as state as well, depending if it fits on the query string, if it's the right thing to kind of expose publicly on the query string. It really depends on what kind of state you're transferring. Some of it, like the user identity, is done through a session cookie, so it just happens. So there's, again, like most problems, there isn't a single way to do it. There's just an option, and depending on your scenarios, you want to pick the right thing. There was a question there.
You showed some basic template handling using JavaScript, and I remember 2 years ago you guys introduced a technology called XML script.
Yep.
Where did that go?
Well, I was particularly fond of XML script because I think it let you do a whole bunch of things declaratively. There were a few shortcomings, so to speak. One was, so for those who don't know, XML script was a way of defining all your behavior of your page as tags separate from the content of your page. And it was all declarative. You didn't have to write a whole ton of JavaScript at all. You said, here's this button component, and when this button gets clicked, go ahead and do that, all declaratively.
Well, now, the templating and data binding were really powerful, actually.
Right, and so along with the declarative event handling, there was also binding. So there were a few shortcomings, as I was saying. One was you had this HTML content, and then you had this behavior part that were very separated. There was no way to extend the raw HTML button to say, hey, go ahead and bind the event, or extend the raw text box and go ahead and say bind the text. You had to kind of duplicate your information about the fact that the button exists or the text box exists in your HTML and in your XML script. And you had to kind of match them up by ID. which makes it fairly cumbersome. And without the full tool support, it made it even more painful, right? So it didn't really catch hold in sort of the broad sort of developer audience. And we're still thinking about what are the next steps. And templating that I kind of showed you is just one small part of what we're thinking going forward, how we want to make things declarative, yet not kind of have these problems that kind of get in the way of actually being productive while doing declarative data binding. So hopefully we'll be seeing a lot more of this templating kind of thing. Like I said, we've been talking about it, and I literally was debating, and I coded it up this morning because I just wanted to kind of show some new stuff that's on the horizon. Any other question there?
Yeah, I'm trying to see, we actually have pages which we want to, rich content pages, which we want to maybe show a lighter version of if the user is coming on a lower connection speed. Do you
Say
think
that again, if the user is what?
coming from with a lower connection speed? So my question is, can you use AJAX to, figure out what the connection speed of a user is and maybe, show a lighter version of the page?
I don't know. So the question is, can I use AJAX to determine the user's sort of network capabilities and adjust my level of functionality accordingly? I don't know if a definitive answer. I mean, there's certainly, I can think of on the spot ways to do this where there's a certain URL that you can go request and it's of a certain size, and you can time how long it took for that request to actually complete. That might give you some indication of what is actually the network capabilities. There are some applications actually that will give you the choice. Do you want to go to the basic version or do you want to go to the enhanced versions, right? Where they're leaving it up to the user, that choice. And so there are ways to go about getting that answer to that question, and then you can obviously use that information.
But you can't do it on the fly. I mean, if I want to do it on the fly without asking you.
Well, so you can still, so if you think about your application as let's say there's a login screen in your application, right? And that's the first thing the user gets to. Some applications have that. You can do a bunch of those types of things on the login page and use that information on subsequent pages. In fact, Outlook Web Access does that. Actually, and to go to the other question you had previously about prefetching or lazily loading, Outlook Web Access does another interesting trick. When you're on the login screen, it actually downloads a whole bunch of resources that it will then use subsequently to actually implement the inbox functionality. So while you're going ahead and typing in your password or waiting to log in, it's actually prefetching stuff because it knows you're going to get to that screen at some point very quickly. There's a hand up here, or maybe you're up there. Does that answer your question? Go ahead. And
all right. When's the futures library going to be the presence library?
Well, in some sense, there's always a future, right? What we want to do is share our ideas, share our thoughts early, get feedback, and understand where what resonates well, what works well, and try to incorporate that into the framework that has that needs to kind of be much more stable, fully supported, and so like the history function that I just showed was in the futures that I think it was probably 8 months ago. It was in the futures build. Now it's actually going to be part of the ASP.NET framework, and the futures build will probably contain some of the templating stuff that we'll do initially. And then as we kind of get feedback and hear what works, we'll actually pull that in or subsequent releases. So there's always going to be a futures build in some sense.
Do you have any time frame though?
For
when we'll start seeing some? We would really use the glitz animation kind of things.
I don't have a specific timeline on the animation feature. Feel free to kind of maybe ping me offline. And gosh, I completely forgot, didn't I? I guess I should have put this up. It just reminded me when I said ping me offline. Well, for the few of you that are still here, there's some URLs there. So anyway, what I was saying was I don't have a specific answer to the animation framework functionality. It's certainly, we've talked about it, saying it's sort of one of the core things we want to bring. By the way, the Atlas, the AJAX control toolkit has an animation framework. It is a separate download though. I'm sure there are more practices. I'm sure there are more interesting things as well. I don't know off the top of my head. If you have something, I'd love to hear. Right. So a bunch of these challenges, like indexability, bookmarkability, accessibility, all of these things all apply to RIA as well, so, like Silverlight apps. So the patterns and practices you employ here can be applied in Silverlight as well, even though the implementation is probably going to be different. But the underlying pattern is the same. Let's take a question there.
So when I'm making asynchronous calls from the client, and I have those two functions, my success function and my fail function, is there an easy way to do custom error messages when I fail?
So the question is, when I'm making web services calls and I have the success callback and the failure callback, what's an easy way to handle errors? Actually, I had this question earlier before the talk as well. And my answer to that would be to think about errors as a normal scenario in your application as opposed to an exception scenario. So you want to think about when you send back a response, how do you indicate that there has been an error as opposed to really think of that as an exception, because errors are very possible and very likely, and you want to handle those as a part of your mainline call. And in fact, if you look at a bunch of third-party web services, like the Flickr one that I was actually using, all of these services have a response object that says, here's the status of the response, and if it's success, then here's the result, which is like, let's say, the list of photos that I was searching for. And if there was an error, it's actually an error object that contains more information about the error code and the error message. So so the simple services that I was kind of showing just were returning the data directly. But if I were writing a real application, I'd be thinking about, hey, what are the errors possible, and account for those in the return value. Does that answer? It's not an automatic. There's nothing automatic here. And the reason why it's not automatic is because you kind of need to author your client application to do something interesting with the error information. And you need the server part of the application to send meaningful information down. More than likely, just sending the exception message and the stack trace is probably the wrong thing to do to send to the client. So it kind of requires a handshake on both sides, both parts of your application, to do the right thing. Go ahead.
Do you have any thoughts or comments on analytics for AJAX applications, measurement?
Question is on analytics around AJAX applications, and I'll extend that to rich internet applications. When I package up this demo, what I'll actually send, what I have is an example of a error tracking sample that tracks unhandled errors, sends down stack traces and client user agent information to the server. And you can kind of do the same thing with user interaction. Like you can track if the user's clicking this button or whatever, and send that information to your server. What information you send and to what server you send depends on your application. There are analytics kinds of services that were primarily used for tracking visitors and how long they were on your site and those types of things. And I believe there's actually a talk on analytics in Silverlight either tomorrow or today. So you might want to look at that. Those same kind of analytics services they typically support sort of custom tracking, and you can use those custom tracking features to actually track user actions. So I don't have a sample, but I believe there's a talk on analytics where the person might actually cover that. Or if not, that you can go ahead and ask your question there as well. Any more questions? Questions on Script Sharp. So for those who don't know, Script Sharp is a personal project of mine that also now has a virtual team at Microsoft. And it's a compiler that takes your C# code and generates JavaScript code. I'll let you in on a secret. all of the script that I showed, I actually wrote it in script sharp first, and then took the script output. And it's just another option. It doesn't replace what I just showed. It just gives you another option. And you're free to download it. It's on codeplex.com/scriptsharp, and provide feedback that way. Lots of teams are using it, but there are no formal plans to productize it right now. Where do I feel? A lot of it depends. A lot of it depends on sort of the feedback I get. It's been out for about 2 years, and it's evolved based on kind of the feedback that teams using it have actually given, both internal and external. Feel free to ping me offline or later over here, and we can talk more about it. If there are no more questions, I'll say thanks again. Thanks for showing up, and hope you have a great rest of MIX. Thank you.